Welcome to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Columbus. Thanks very much for being with us. Our guest this week is Andrew Biggio. He's a U.S. Marine Corps veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, and he's also very passionate about something near and dear to our hearts here at the American Veterans Center and Veterans Chronicles, and that is listening to the oral histories of our veterans and preserving them for future generations. He's recently released The Rifle, Combat Stories from America's Last World War II Veterans, told through an M1 Garand. And Andrew, thanks very much for your time today.
It's awesome to be here.
Well, we will certainly spend a lot of time talking about your amazing book, which I highly recommend to everyone, but we also want to make sure we chronicle your story of service. So let's begin there. Where were you born and raised?
I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, and raised in and around the North Shore of Boston, Massachusetts. And I lived in the towns of Everett and the town of Winthrop.
And I know from the book that there's a history of service in your family. In fact, your name is in honor of a family member who served in World War II, correct?
Right. My grandfather's brother was killed in action at age 19 in Italy with the 34th Infantry Division. And myself and my dad are both named after my great uncle. When
did you join the service, and why did you choose the Marine Corps?
I enlisted in 2006. Why I chose the Marines is simply I heard they were tough and they had a great uniform. That was pretty much the end of it there. And naturally, September 11th was the real push to stay focused on that dream.
Marine Corps Basic is no joke, so tell me about your experience.
Okay, boot camp at Parris Island, South Carolina. I got to Parris Island on 6/6/06. So I got there on 6/6/6, and it was hell. Especially for an 18-year-old kid who's never left home before. It was tough. It was definitely a rude awakening to the real world, and having to go to wake up earlier than us and go to bed later than us, and then still do all the physical requirements that we had to do on a daily basis. And I think it taught me a lot of discipline. It really did. It taught me a lot of discipline and a lot of self-bearing.
What unit were you assigned to ultimately?
So I got out of boot camp, and I was in a program at the time, which I don't think they have anymore. It was called a 92-day reservist. And so what they would allow you to do is, if you showed the recruiter you were going to go to college in the fall upon graduating high school, they would send you to boot camp. And then after boot camp, they'd send you go to college and you join the reserve unit that is in your state. So I started off with 1st Battalion, 25th Marines while I attended college. I actually got taken away from that unit to go to Iraq by 2007, 2008. And they called me what I was called as an augment. So I augmented with the 1st Marine Division to Iraq. In 2008 was my first tour.
2008, you're deployed to Iraq. What were your duties? Where was your unit in Iraq?
My unit was assigned to the Al Anbar province, and we fell under 1st Marine Division there at Al-Assad Air Base. And as an infantry unit, we would go out for 4 or 5 days at a time and just secure the area of operation outside Al-Assad, which was a big air base at that time. And that was a long deployment. We did that for 9 months, and we got home safely. It was during President Bush's surge in Iraq, so I got to see that side of theater's campaign. And then I came home, finished college, and got deployed to Afghanistan with 1st Battalion, 25th Marines. And for my deployment in Afghanistan, I served with 1st Battalion, 25th Marines upon graduating college.
How would you describe the enemy in both places and what it was like to actually be in combat against them?
In Afghanistan, you could tell they were not a courageous enemy. I was there in 2011. It was really during a lot of major offenses and a lot of fighting to really re-secure Helmand province. And they were a hit-and-run, scared enemy. They wouldn't want to face off with U.S. Marines directly. My unit in particular, where we had up against them, the only thing that we had been attacked by was indirect fire, mortars or rockets, and then, of course, the IED. So they were, to me, cowards. They would hit us with, indirect fire and then only attack when they were attacking Afghan police or Afghan army, which they knew they could probably get the upper hand on or shoot or kill them. But they seemed to fear the U.S. Marines where I was.
Obviously, this is a fluid situation. You and I are talking in late August of 2021 when there's a lot of instability in Afghanistan. The evacuations are still going on at this point. After having served there, how do you process that?
It's kind of a worst case scenario. If not, it's even worse than the worst case scenario. Just to see them have taken over the whole country, the fact they're immediately recognized as a form of government, the fact that the family members of our interpreters and anyone who worked with U.S. forces, anyone that was in the Afghan army, and anyone that the Taliban might have got their hands on as far as intelligence of who worked with us is trying to rapidly flee the country. It's very hard to process. At first, I acted like I didn't care, and now watching it, it's completely embarrassing. I am embarrassed. I was very proud, and I still am a proud Afghanistan veteran, but I don't know why we ended it like this.
Andrew, you spent 6 years total in the Marine Corps. What do you think are the most significant ways you were changed in those 6 years?
You know, the Marine Corps installed discipline in me, for sure. Fitness, physical health, discipline, experience as far as being in situations that extreme a lot of pressure. And it helped me learn a lot about my fellow man, just the different cultural backgrounds of which everyone came from all over the country to join the military services. It was really the first best education I got on social issues amongst people and where they were from, whether down south or up north, poor or rich. So I have a bachelor's degree and a master's degree, and the military was the best thing I ever did.
As you mentioned, you came home, you got your degree, you became a police officer, and I believe you still are, correct?
Yep, I've been a police officer for 8 years now.
So when and how did you get the idea to interview some of our World War II heroes?
You know, I live in a town where we name all the local squares after young men who were killed in war, whether it's Korea or Vietnam or World War II, and predominantly most of them are World War II. So it's not unnormal to see a square named after Private Joe Smith or Andrew Bigio. So every day I had to pass that town square that said Andrew Bigio Square. And finally, being a survivor of two conflicts myself, I said, I need to find out what happened to that Andrew Bigio. I felt really guilty that this 19-year-old kid had been killed and I came home safely. So I really wanted to get down to earth to find out what happened to him. So I started to read his letters home. His last letters he wrote home before he was killed, and he talked about how much he enjoyed the M1 rifle, the M1 Garand, in one of his letters. So I had to go out and buy an M1 Garand. I wanted to feel what he felt. I wanted to hold what he held. And I purchased one. I purchased a 1945 M1 Garand rifle. You know, the standard rifle of that time, the weapon that almost everybody was issued, they lived with, they slept with, they liberated with, they came home with. And I'm holding it in my living room, and I'm like, now what? Now what do I do? So who else would appreciate this weapon system so much besides me? And I took it to a neighbor of mine who fought in the Battle of Okinawa, Joe Drago. He was 92 at the time. And when I went over his house, you know, he was pretty much bound to his recliner. He was 92. He wasn't getting exercise. He wasn't going out much. His legs had atrophied, really skinny. He was weak and hunched over. And when I put that M1 into his arms, into his hands, it was like he was a 19-year-old kid again. He raised it up, put it in his shoulder. He's smiling from ear to ear. He's waving the rifle around. And he starts telling me about the Battle of Okinawa for over 2 hours. 2 hours that nothing I knew about until I put this rifle into his hands. It acted as a microphone. So I asked him, I said, Joe, you please sign this rifle. I want you to add your name to the wooden stock. Sign your rifle on it. And he did. And when I left his house, I looked down at that name on my rifle and I said, I need to collect as many signatures as possible. I want to hear all these stories. And I knew I was in a race against time.
It's such a fantastic aspect of the story. Not only the great idea to have it with you, to have them hold it, which brings back obviously many different memories, but having them sign it, and the memories that you elicited not only from Joe Drago, but so many others in this book, and many others who aren't profiled in the book, because I believe you had well over 100 signatures on there. We're going to talk about all of that in just a moment. We'll be right back with Andrew Bigio. The book is The Rifle: Combat Stories from America's Last World War II Veterans, told through an M1 Garand. I'm Greg Corumbus. We'll be right back. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corumbus, honored to be joined today by Andrew Biggio. He's a veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan, a U.S. Marine Corps veteran, and he's the author of The Rifle, Combat Stories from America's Last World War II Veterans, told through an M1 Garand. And Andrew, you told the story about taking the gun, first of all, to your neighbor, who you kind of thought was just a grump for most of the time when you were growing up, Joe Drago, veteran of the horrific Battle of Okinawa in the Pacific, where he was a gunner and saw a lot of bloodshed. What did you learn about that battle through him and how much he still carries those days with him?
Yeah, Joe really taught me that, war isn't always black and white. He really exposed a lot of the deep, dark, horrendous truths about fighting in the Pacific, something that we really do overlook. And I think getting an introduction to Joe was probably the best World War II veteran I could have been introduced to, because as an Iraq and Afghanistan veteran, you're asking yourself from the very beginning, I served in two wars that aren't so popular, and you're kind of asking the meaning of everything. And to meet Joe, he really made you look at World War II differently, because he would talk about the brute force it took to win the Pacific, and kind of things that would get today's service members in jail or prison, and have actually put service members in jail and prison. And they did what they had to do to win that front on the Pacific by total brute force, something that we don't do today, we can't do today, and might be part of the reason why we haven't seen anybody, raise a white flag since. And so he really brought some normalcy to my thinking that, we don't have to live in the shadows of the World War II veterans, because they went through some of the stuff we did, and they came home a certain way as well from it. And it's often covered up or hidden by that 1940s time frame of the media, where they kind of hid and covered up anything dark that made America look bad.
We'll talk more about that as we get further into this, and particularly how some of these veterans dealt with combat fatigue. Another name that you knew but hadn't actually met until the book project was Roy Rausch, if I'm saying that name correctly. You had gotten his book in your early days as a Marine, but you finally got to interview him, and man, what a life. 4 brutal battles in the Pacific, first of all, from Guadalcanal all the way up to Saipan and Tinian. You call him the most interesting man in the world. Why?
Dr. Roy Rausch, treasure hunter Rausch, pilot Rausch, Corporal Rausch. I mean, these are just some of the titles he had. That's why he's so interesting. He did a little bit of everything in life, really starting off with those Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Tinian battles. And he gave me a picture of the forefront of the Pacific that was just, he couldn't have painted it any more. Talking to him was like talking to a 30-year-old guy about remembering something. And then he came home and then went from being a combat Marine in the Pacific to joining the Air Force, becoming a pilot. He came home, then started to work for Lockheed Martin. He wrote the training manuals for Lockheed Martin. Then when finally he retires, he becomes a certified treasure hunter, where he goes all over the world diving to find, pirate wrecks and ships and treasure and gold and all sorts of things. And he stayed so busy to kind of forget the horrors of war, the endless amounts of bodies they witnessed just in those 4 island hopping campaigns alone. And Roy truly was a Marine's Marine, somewhere where I feel like I hope to be at his age too. I don't want to just stop at being a police officer. I want to keep going, to keep my mind going, and to be able to look back at all of the tragedy or chaos in my life and use it as a positive experience.
The second veteran that you profile in the book is Ernie Roberts, who was a machine gunner at the Bulge and who also took part in the crossing of the Rhine. So both he and Drago were machine gunners. You were a rifleman, but did you pretty quickly have a connection with these guys despite the many years in difference in your age?
Yeah, I realized nothing's ever changed. You're still that angry little bitter infantryman, no matter which war you served in. And I thought that was pretty unique about them, that there was something different there. There was something about throwing a machine gun on your shoulder or carrying ammunition and living outside in a dirt hole and eating whatever food you come by that has never changed, from modern wars all the way back to World War II. And I look at these guys not just as some older senior veterans who I respect, but as brothers for sure.
That's awesome. I love to hear that. And the very next profile is Clarence Cormier. Is that how we say that? Might be one of the most gripping stories. Never fired a gun, was a POW of the Germans, but they never sent him to a prison camp. Describe some of the horrific things he was forced to endure on what he called a death march. Accurately, I would say.
Clarence Cormier served with a unit that we don't hear a lot about in general studies, and that's the 106th Infantry Division. And they had one of the largest surrenders since the American Civil War. Somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 men surrendered right at the beginning of the Battle of the Bulge. And Clarence was one of those guys. He wasn't even in Europe 2 weeks. And next thing you know, he has a Mauser pointed on his face. His boots are being removed from his feet. And he's now a prisoner of war being stuffed in a big boxcar train headed for Germany. And he got everything else you hear from these POWs in all the other camps: lice, extreme weight loss, beards, filthy, emancipate, basically all of the stuff, skin and bones, that kind of thing. But what's really was different about Clarence was his trip to Germany. I mean, they were stuffed, thousands of these men were stuffed in this boxcar on a railroad heading for Germany when American planes spotted it. And these American planes assumed it was just a German resupply train, and they started to attack it and strafe it. Little did they know they were strafing and killing their own Americans, their own American POWs. And the frantic struggle that Clarence describes trying to get out of the train and inform the letters with human bodies, the letters POWs, so the airplanes would stop shooting at them, was something I'll never forget, watching a 95-year-old man cry, reminiscing about that story.
Andrew, let's pause there. We'll be right back with much more of your story and talk much more about your book right here on Veterans Chronicles. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corumbus. Thanks very much for being with us. Our guest in this edition is Andrew Bigio, a U.S. Marine Corps veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. His book, The Rifle: Combat Stories from America's Last World War II Veterans, told through an M1 Garand. And as we foreshadowed in the previous segment, Andrew, these first three guys in your book, and I'm sure several others, if not most of them, dealt with combat fatigue, or what we now know as post-traumatic stress. That's much more openly talked about now. How did they and the others perhaps deal with that in an era when it was far less acceptable to discuss?
They dealt with it in ways that basically still kept it under wraps. Their issues, everything they were dealing with. I've had veterans admit to me that they attempted suicide. I had veterans admit to me that they drank until, the 60s, until their wife was ready to leave them or their family was in shambles, and then they finally got off the booze. Or I had one guy who I took to Normandy, and his son pulled me aside. He said, I just want to let you know what an evil guy my dad was growing up. He would beat me, beat my mom. He was just an angry drunk. And now that you brought me back to Normandy and I've seen what he went through in the battle, now I can see why. I can see. And I couldn't believe that, it took a years for his father to straighten out. And I also interviewed so many World War II veterans who later became police officers. And I always enjoyed doing that because I always wanted to ruin the stigma that combat veterans shouldn't be police officers because they have PTSD. Well, I interviewed a lot of World War II veterans who came home from Normandy and fighting in the Pacific who went on to become great police officers and even police chiefs. And the stuff and the calls they responded to for veterans having, PTSD episodes or psychosis issues showed me that PTSD was the same back then as it is now, and that it's not just a new developing thing. This Iraq and Afghanistan veteran generation isn't broken. This stuff's always been going on.
Amazing. Let's talk about some of the other veterans you profile here. Bernie Ruchin served in the 2nd Marine Division in the battle for Saipan, and he survived what you say is believed to be the biggest banzai attack from the Japanese during the war. Explain what a banzai attack is and how he dealt with that.
So kind of a last-ditch effort for Japanese soldiers, if they had ever, ran out of ammo or if they thought they were surrounded or whatever, they would attack with katana swords and rush the Marine Corps front lines or the Army's front lines in a last-ditch effort to, either A, break the lines or just plainly sacrifice themselves. So at the end of Saipan, at the end of the battle, the Japanese had their backs pretty much to the ocean, and the U.S. Navy had destroyed part of the Japanese fleet, so they weren't going to go get rescued. They weren't getting resupplied. That was it. So some 2,000 Japanese soldiers decided one night with swords, spears, bayonets, and little ammunition decided to rush the Marine Corps and Army lines on Saipan. Over 2,000 Japanese. And not only did it break the front lines, they made it all the way back to the field artillery in the rear, where to the point where the field artillery had their guns pointed point blank range and were just shooting at the waves of Japanese. And the Japanese had even commandeered an American howitzer, and the other Marine Corps howitzer had to have a duel with another howitzer.
Yeah, that is extraordinarily intense, and it's the same story for so many of these other veterans in the book. I also want to talk about the fact that you traveled with several of these. You just mentioned the one in Normandy. There's Rodney Perkins, who you went back to Europe with, and he seemed to have very mixed emotions about what he saw so many decades later. And then you also have very emotional recounting of your trip back to Italy with two veterans. One is Al Bucarelli, who you took and found the grave of his fallen corporal in Italy, and he was very moved by that. And then also Rocco Talese, who brought pictures with him, and the people in the village identified themselves in the pictures, and there was a great celebration. You say in the book that you really can't even find the words to explain the emotion in each of these situations. How would you describe it now that you've had a little more time to process it?
I'm just grateful. I'm thankful God let me experience that. There's not many people on this planet who can say they brought a World War II veteran back to the vicinity where he lost his leg 75 years later, and also to locate his squad leader, his grave, and bring this man back to see his squad leader's grave, and closing out that chapter, that final forever chapter in that man's life. The words I can just, I'm blessed to have done that, and I'm glad God put me in Al's life to complete that, because it taught me so much, and it also just hooked me. It hooked me to want to keep bringing veterans over to Europe, and the only thing that has halted that is just COVID-19.
Woody Williams is perhaps the most well-known person in the book. He's a Medal of Honor recipient, I believe the last living Medal of Honor recipient from World War II entirely, certainly from the Battle of Iwo Jima. He received that honor due to his heroism with a flamethrower there. But he also, because of the fact he's either one of or the last World War II Medal of Honor recipient, sees a great responsibility to tell his story in as many places as long as he can. Talk about his actions on Iwo Jima and how he sees his role now.
Woody is accredited to opening up the way for his battalion to push through on Iwo Jima when there was nobody left. There was no demolition left. There was no other flamethrowers. And Woody stepped up to help destroy several enemy pillboxes on Iwo Jima. And that included making his way with a fire team of infantrymen to these pillboxes, and one by one placing his flamethrower in the aperture or the vent of the enemy pillboxes. I think in one pillbox alone there was something like 17 Japanese soldiers, they said. And just to be a young Marine and to be even allowed in the same home as Woody, again, almost 75 years later, it was like sitting in front of a god. This is someone who really, embodied the word Semper Fi, because not only did he get the Medal of Honor, but then he dedicated his entire life to helping veterans afterwards. He retired from the Marine Corps. He joined the VA hospital. He retired from the VA hospital, and now he runs a nonprofit dedicated to building Gold Star monuments all over the country for Gold Star family members.
It's an amazing story, and it's continuing. He's in fantastic shape, like you mentioned. So, Lord willing, he'll be around many more years to share his story. But Woody Williams is certainly an American treasure, and so are so many of these other veterans that you've interviewed here. One who is perhaps the most entertaining character was one you found just while you were waiting at an airport in Atlanta. Stanley Sassine, and you could tell he was a character from the moment you walked into that assisted living center, and he even mentioned that he drank you under the table. So in addition to the fact that he's so much fun, he's also a great example of how you, I think, paid great attention to bring in veterans of all different theaters in the war. Italy is one in Europe that probably doesn't get as much attention as other places in the Western Front. And then Stanley, for example, was from the China, Burma, India theater. And so talk a little bit about him and that experience, and also how you went about making sure you got as many vets from as many different parts of the war as you could.
Yeah, Stanley was a milestone on the rifle because he was the first person to represent the fighting in Burma, and not just the fighting in Burma, but the ground jungle combat in which Merrill's Marauders took part in. He was a replacement. He was sent to Burma on a whim. Basically, I think it was originally he was supposed to be just a truck driver, and next thing you know, he's on this little tiny plane being flown into the Burmese jungles to fight alongside Merrill's Marauders, where he's then shot by a sniper. And this is a fantastic story about this man just living out his golden years in an elderly housing facility in Georgia until I stumbled upon him. That was a huge milestone to represent parts of World War II that you don't hear about, especially the China, Burma, India theater.
Now, Stanley Sassine, as you mentioned, got shot. It's an injury to his shoulder, which still doesn't work right. And that makes me wonder, a lot of these different veterans you interviewed were wounded. How do they deal with their injuries that have lasted decades?
They live. They do. They just live with them. I know several men who, were injured, became postmen, became letter carriers, and they, didn't have full use of their left arm, but they still managed to retire and get a career and not even collect a disability. Al didn't collect a disability for a long time. Stanley Sassine never got, his shoulder muscles back, but he would keep a towel hung over his shoulder to avoid people asking questions about the hole in his shoulder. So they just trucked right along and never felt sorry for themselves, any of these men that were wounded.
Another veteran you feature is John Cazarros, and his story could be a novel or a movie in and of itself. Member of a B-17 bomber crew, shot down on the run from the Nazis in France for months. But his ability to think and adapt on the fly, I remember reading from the historian Stephen Ambrose that ingenuity when the plan didn't go according to plan is what set us apart from the Nazis and really gave us an advantage. Was that ingenuity a result of the training? Was it just natural instinct or a combination of the two? How do you sum up what these people were able to do when things clearly didn't go the way they were supposed to?
The stories from World War II are just unmatched. They're just unmatched. The stories you hear and you learn every day. I mean, whole sets of brothers fighting and dying, father and son fighting together. It just took the whole world, the whole country rather, to just be on the same page and want the same goal, and that was to defeat evil, defeat Nazism. And of course, the media helped that. The newspapers, the televisions was all Nazis bad, Japanese bad. It really will influence the country to come together and fight for a single cause, something that we've totally lost over time. And I think it's just because everyone had something at stake and something to lose during World War II, no matter what your political background was or any type of social background. So I think that's played a lot in it. I think just the will to know, to want to, the attack on Pearl Harbor. And so American ingenuity, and then of course the people who couldn't serve that just came out, the women, the everybody that came to work in the different mills and factories too, that we were just pumping out more aircraft carriers, more B-17s, more tanks than anybody.
in addition to making sure different theaters and different parts of the war got mentioned in this book, and all with gripping stories. It's not like anyone was just in there because they were in a certain place. They're all fascinating and harrowing in a number of different ways. You also feature some units you either didn't know existed, like the 17th Airborne Division, or ones that probably don't get as much credit as they deserve, like the 10th Armored Division from the Battle of the Bulge. So talk about what kind of a priority that was for you in the book.
The rifle itself was to represent the units and men and stories you never heard about. Much of World War II, we cover the 101st Airborne jumping into Normandy or the flag raising on Iwo Jima, and we kind of miss everything in between. These other units who may have not been there on D-Day or June 6th, but filled in after. And their roles were just as important or just as tough because they're the ones who had to replace the 101st Airborne or the 82nd Airborne or the Big Red One. So I was primarily wanted to collect signatures on the rifle of the units and divisions you never heard about, something like the 10th Armored Division and the 17th Airborne. And the 10th Armored was extremely important in the battle in Europe because they were the first ones in Bastogne. 10th Armored Combat Command B were the first men in Bastogne before the 101st Airborne, and it was they who held off the first German patrols for 19 hours before the paratroopers even got there. And then the 17th Airborne, they entered the Battle of the Bulge just as regular infantry. It may have said Airborne on their shoulder, but at that time they had not jumped into any combat zone. They had not jumped in, they did not make any combat jumps. They were being thrown in there just used as regular infantry. And then they were assigned with the task of Operation Varsity, jumping over the Rhine River into the fatherland of Germany, the country that started it all. And that's a pretty daring thing to do.
I love the fact that those stories are in there, and specifically with veterans who served with great distinction in those particular situations. As you mentioned, Andrew, there's an abundance of honor throughout America's role in World War II, but there are some things the military got wrong, and I think most people know about two in particular. One was the internment of Japanese Americans, and then the segregation of the armed forces along racial lines. You tell the stories of Lawson Sakai, who served in the highly decorated 442nd Regimental Combat Team, comprised of Japanese Americans, and then Robert Andre, a member of the all-black 761st Tank Battalion. How important was it for you to make sure their stories were part of this mosaic too?
It was super important. I didn't want the whole rifle just to represent Caucasian white males who fought in World War II, and that I wanted to represent the whole war on the rifle. So not only was I checking off the box of all these different campaigns that were fought, but it was time to check off the box of different units, and that included segregated infantry units, segregated tank battalions. So Lawson Sakai came from I Company of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, which, as you stated, went to be one of the most highly decorated infantry regiments of all time. They fought to Italy and then were sent to France and were in charge of rescuing the lost battalion of the 36th Division stuck in the Vosges Mountains in France. So that's a super important and pivotal moment where generals are trying to rush to Germany. They want to be the first general to, cross the Rhine River or push into Germany or sack this German city and do that they actually got a whole battalion of the 36th Division surrounded in the Vosges Mountains. And who'd they send? The damn good Japanese Americans to get them. And that Japanese American unit proved everyone wrong. They proved Congress wrong, who initially didn't want Japanese Americans to serve in the armed forces. And they proved any type of racial hating tensions wrong of Americans who were just mad that the Empire of Japan itself attacked Pearl Harbor. So that was a story that needed to be told, especially as an infantryman myself, of meeting these badass infantrymen like Lawson Sakai with 3 Purple Hearts and 2 Bronze Stars. And then you go back to Europe and you talk about the first black tank battalion to see combat in Europe ever in mankind history, the 761st Tank Battalion. And what meeting a man who's now 96, Robert Andre, with still German Panzerfaust burns all over his body, being one of the first tanks to roll into the town of Moorville, the first experimental operation where they were going to use black tankers with white infantrymen. And the sad story of how these white infantrymen and black tankers are taught a little story about that race doesn't mean anything and you all bleed the color red. And that the 761st fighting with the 26th Division in France really taught a lot of people with any type of racist thinking that that you're not all brothers, especially when you need it most.
Andrew, very well stated. We have more to discuss about this amazing book, and we'll do so in just a moment here on Veterans Chronicles. Our guest is Andrew Bigio, U.S. Marine Corps veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. The book is The Rifle, Combat Stories from America's Last World War II Veterans, told through an M1 Garand. I'm Greg Corumbus. Please stay with us. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corumbus. Our guest this week, Andrew Bigio, U.S. Marine Corps veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. His book, The Rifle, Combat Stories from America's Last World War II Veterans, told through an M1 Garand. And something we see throughout these stories, Andrew, of course, is the devotion to duty in soldiers. And one that I think really crystallizes that is Nelson Bryant, a paratrooper from the 82nd Airborne, horribly wounded in Normandy. When you read how he was injured, you think there's no way this guy's going to make it, but obviously he did since you're talking to him. But he was told he was not allowed to jump again when the Airborne was about to head into Holland, but he managed to rejoin his unit again anyway. Please tell that story and then just talk more generally about the devotion to duty you saw in these guys.
Oh, the devotion to duty, the want to be with your men was the same 75 years ago as it was today. And just seeing Nelson, who gets shot through the chest by an MG-42 while outside Hill 30 in Normandy, where D Company of the 508th jumped in. You know, he's evacuated. The hole in his back, the exit wound's not even healed up yet, and he finds out that the 82nd's about to make another jump into Holland, and he goes, basically AWOL from the hospital, and he's so weak from his chest trauma, from his recovery, that he needs help buckling his parachute harness. He needs help getting lifted into the plane, and they give him a carbine because he can no longer hold the M1 Garand anymore. I mean, that's somebody who really wanted to be there. And he jumps out into Holland, and he's so weak he can't unbuckle his harness, so he cuts his way out of it. And then later on, his bayonet and parts of his harness are found 75 years later in a barn in the Netherlands and returned to him. And when I asked, why'd you do it? Why did you go against doctor's orders, leave the hospital, and almost risk your life again when you're, recovering from a chest wound like that? And he just said, he looked up into the sky, 75 years later in front of me, and goes, I just had to be with those guys. I had to. And I could just tell that he was just seeing himself jump out of that C-47 again. Amazing.
Absolutely amazing. One other veteran before we get back to your own personal story, because there had to be one in the book, and of course you remembered to do this, and that's the story of a veteran who came across a concentration camp. In this case, it was Bob White. What did he see there?
Bob White basically helped liberate, small subcamps and prisons during his push over the Rhine River and into Germany. And if I remember correctly, he was telling me just people could not believe the amount of bodies. They would see one location where bodies were stacked up, and they'd be like, well, if you think that's bad, don't go over to this corner, or don't go behind this building. They're stacked up, almost to the sky, that kind of thing. And, from there, he also admitted to me that, the Americans, without, fear of trial, would march SS into the woods and then come back out without them. So you started to see people just really committing all sorts of atrocity towards the end of the war here.
Again, we're talking with Andrew Bigio. The book is The Rifle, Combat Stories from America's Last World War II Veterans, told through an M1 Garand. And Andrew, at the beginning of our discussion about the book, you talked about how this was all really driven by your desire to know more about what happened to, I guess, the original Andrew Bigio, your great uncle, who was killed in action in Italy. Talk about what you learned about him and how it impacted your appreciation of your own family's military history.
Yeah, I finally started to interview men from the 34th Division. I think the rifle was probably almost full of signatures. And I said, oh, hey, I got to get some more guys from the Red Bull Division, the 34th Infantry Division. I got to try to find out, what happened in September of 1944 in Italy in a campaign called the North Apennines. And I started to meet survivors that from B Company of the 135th Regiment, same as my Uncle Andy, and what they described as uphill battle in central Italy, while U.S. forces and Allied forces are already pushing forward in France and in Holland, and these units that were just left in Italy, and they were left in Italy because they had to maintain some 30 German divisions that were still held on the Italian peninsula. That was their main objective. Doesn't matter how far the Allies are getting towards Germany, you still have to push up this bloody boot of Italy. And they did so in almost like a Vietnam manner fashion, where you had to keep going up these hills. You have the enemy pointing their guns directly down at you. And even though you're reading the headlines and reading the stars and stripes that the Americans are, close to the Rhine River or jumping into Holland. So you've seen a lot of men and a lot of stories you hear on this Italian front of mutiny and disobeying of orders and these suicide missions that these men didn't want to do. And the one that my uncle was put on outside Barberino, Italy, he was one of the men who stayed on the hill while so many other men retreated. And because of that, it ultimately cost him his 19-year-old brave life.
Wow. Andrew, couple things I just want to make sure we get to before we run out of time here. First of all, I just want to know how this project changed you. It became something so much bigger than just finding out what happened in your own family. How has this changed you in terms of collecting these oral histories?
Oh, well, it changed me a lot. These men didn't just teach me how to be a good veteran. They taught me how to be a good husband, a good father, how to handle stressful incidents, and how to live a successful life post-military experience, whether it be, career-wise, education-wise, and just morally making the right decisions in life, and to reach the finish line like they did. That's where I want to be. That's what they taught me, and I'm hoping that one day younger veterans can do the same with my generation.
And lastly, I know from reading the book that you also have a foundation that assists wounded veterans. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, for the last 11 years, I run the Boston's Wounded Vet Run, which is a motorcycle charity ride to help severely wounded veterans. And we do so by a motorcycle ride, in which we either pay off their debt, provide housing modifications, transportation needs, buy them brand new cars. Any veteran who's been traumatically wounded or injured in training, doesn't have to be necessarily combat, we'll step in and help them. And I've been doing that for 11 years for those who came back not so fortunate from the battlefield.
Andrew, it's an amazing record of personal service on your part. It's also an amazing book. Thank you for sharing it with us. Thanks for your service, and thanks for your time today. We really appreciate it.
I'm proud to be on this and hope to be in D.C. soon with you guys.
Excellent. Andrew Bigio is a U.S. Marine Corps veteran of Iraq and Afghanistan. He is also the author of The Rifle, Combat Stories from America's Last World War II Veterans, told through an M1 Garand. I'm Greg Corumbus, and this is Veterans Chronicles. Hi, this is Greg Corumbus, and thanks for listening to Veterans Chronicles, a presentation of the American Veterans Center. For more information, please visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org. You can also follow the American Veterans Center on Facebook, and on Twitter, we're at AVC Update. Subscribe to the American Veterans Center YouTube channel for full oral histories and special features, and of course, please subscribe to the Veterans Chronicles podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and please join us next time for Veterans Chronicles.